Hi and welcome. Let's talk about the kernel oscillator engine. This type of oscillator was brought to us with operating system version 2, and I have to admit that I'm not an FM expert, but I want to try to explain FM just very roughly. FM, of course, means frequency modulation, and the well-known synthesizer for FM is of course the DX7 from Yamaha. Normally FM means that you have operators which are equal to the kernels in the quantum. Operators are normally sine wave oscillators at audio range. And you can decide if one operator is a modulation source or an audio source. And you can modulate your audio sources with modulators. And you can also modulate your modulators with other modulators. And the way you combine all your operators or kernels together is the algorithm. The quantum provides even more possibilities than that, because the operators are not necessarily sine wave oscillators, but can be also sawtooth or even wavetables. And you can decide if you're using real frequency modulation, but you can also use AM, amplitude modulation, or PM, phase modulation. The Yamaha DX7 actually does phase modulation, but let's have a look on the quantum. I'm going to load a new initial patch into the quantum, and we can choose the kernel mode in the menu or by pressing the first two selection buttons. And now we're in the kernel mode. And the kernel mode has two different layers. You have the performance mode of the kernel mode and the editing mode. In the performance mode you can choose different templates, like a simple FM bell, and you can change the parameters of this FM sound by using your 5 knobs. And every parameter of your FM sound can also be the destination for a modulation in your modulation matrix. So actually you're using templates to change the basic sound of your kernel oscillator. But you can also enter the editing mode and create your own templates. So as you can see here, we have an algorithm. We can also switch between different algorithms. The audio oscillators are always in color, and all other oscillators or kernels or operators are in white. So you can choose a basic preset. You can also initialize the presets to start creating your own algorithm. But let's start with this one. So we have one oscillator, one operator, one kernel, which is an audio source, because it's here in color. As you can hear, it's a sine wave. Now we can enter this kernel and change the type of the operator. You can also change the phase of the operator. And here On the second side, you have the frequencies. Here, in this parameter, you can change the way how the operator should behave. So normally, operators are not necessarily in the perfect pitch, especially when they are modulation sources. So in ratio mode, you can change the pitch of the operators, and the ratio is actually the multiplication for the frequency. So 1 means standard frequency, 2 means double frequency or 1 octave above, 4 means frequency times 2 and then again times 2, so 2 octaves above. And everything in between does sound different. But the ratio can also be divided down, so that this would mean 1 octave below. And again, everything in between is not in perfect pitch. Then you can define the ratio plus an offset. You can change it also in semitones. You can define a fixed frequency for the operator. And you can perform the operator in LFO mode. But the first kernel is an audio source, so we are not going to change the ratio. And now we can define a second kernel, which will be the modulation source of the first kernel. So we select the second kernel and we can turn it on. And now when we want to hear a modulation, we can increase the intensity of the modulation. And now when we want to decide in which way we want to modulate the first kernel, we select the first kernel and we can change the modulation type, like TrueFM for instance. You can see TF. We select the second kernel, which is the modulation source, and we can define that the second kernel will be, for instance, in LFO mode. So as you can hear, it's a true frequency modulation. It's performing a vibrato. Now we can select a different modulation type, like phase. And you hear a different result. The ring modulation is actually some kind of multiplication of both signals. The AM is the amplitude modulation, so the volume of sound. And the modulation type wavetable position is only important if the audio kernel is a wavetable kernel. So we select wavetable, of course, and we hear a wavetable modulation. And we can also define a feedback within every operator. So let's say we choose the operator K2. And the operator is modulating itself. Okay, so this doesn't sound really interesting. Amplitude modulation, the modulation of the wavetable position, this is all what we already have. So the special thing about the kernel oscillator is that you can do all of this at audio rate. And now comes the fun part. If you're doing this not with a modulation source in LFO mode, but in an audio mode, then you get very interesting results. Every operator has, additionally to that, not just the wave selection page or the page where you can define which modulation sources will be used for this operator and which type of modulation will be performed, but you can also define a multi-stage envelope for the intensity of the operator, which is the loudness for the audio source operators and the modulation intensity for modulation source operators. And you can also change the intensity of every operator relatively to your keyboard. So this is how you can define your algorithm. But there is a modulation matrix within one kernel oscillator. So we go back to the patch and we click on control, and now as you can see we can also define modulation destinations and assign every knob to different parameters of the operators, so that we can define an own template and so that we can use these knobs as destination sources in our main modulation matrix of the quantum. And you can even create own names for the knobs, which you are going to see here on this page. So the fact that every template has different names for the knobs means that you can define your own names for the parameters which you assign when you edit the different controls and the modulations. Okay, so with the kernel mode you can have a lot of fun and create real FM sounds. And remember, this was just one oscillator, so you can do this also with oscillator 2 and 3. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.